Hi, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's World Affairs program. I'm Ray Suarez. I'm the host of On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs. My next book, We're Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, will be published next spring by Little Brown. World Affairs is a San Francisco-based nonprofit, a nonpartisan forum that explores international issues and ideas beyond borders in all their nuance and complexity. I'm here with Mara Rudman, the Executive Vice President for Policy at American Progress, where she works to create smart strategies and find the path to turn ideas into action and action into results. She served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Her government positions have included Deputy Envoy and Chief of Staff for the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace at the State Department, and Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She was also appointed to the 2022 National Defense Strategy Commission. For you in the audience, if you decide you want to ask a question, ask it in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer it when we take Q&A at the end of the program. Mara Rudman, welcome to World Affairs.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Let's start by looking all the way back to the beginning of your time in the Clinton White House. If you look at America's way of seeing the world, the country's assumptions about the Middle East, key alliances and partnerships in the region, what's changed between then and now?
Many of the relationships have stayed quite similar, and some have grown and strengthened in terms of the Middle East, countries in the Middle East. Some may have waxed and waned over the years, but there's actually a remarkable amount of consistency from President Clinton's administration to President Bush's, to President Obama, more variation during President Trump's presidency, but also some similarities there. I think where the biggest changes have come is more in the global context in terms of where the President Clinton's team may have thought or predicted the world was going in terms of where we were with Russia, where we were with China, and the changes over from 2000, later in the Bush administration, even in kind of recognizing, I would say, the extent to which we were in very direct and intense competition with China and what that meant for our relationships in other regions. So I wouldn't say that contributed to the waxing and waning, but it was part of the calculation on what was going to be very important and where and how the United States reinforced country-specific and regional relationships, understanding what Russia and China were doing at the same time and how it affected the United States relationships with those two countries as well.
Thinking back to the Clinton years, of course, it was before 9/11, before the twin invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, before the Arab Spring, before the Syrian civil war. Which countries are seen in a different way by the U.S., and which countries regard the U.S., its intentions, its usefulness, its interests in a different way now? And given what you just said, in part because there are other players like China.
So I would say that if we're talking again about countries in the Middle East specifically, and I would qualify just a bit in the sense that we were not on the ground at war with Iraq or with Afghanistan. In the Clinton administration, there was a lot of back and forth and significant tensions with Iraq. There was the Al-Qaeda threat, things that led to both U.S. interventions in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it wasn't, those things weren't on the plate or the horizon in any way during the Clinton years. But I would say that that the relationship with with every country in the region, I would say in one way or another with every country in the world, is affected by how the United States, China, Russia act or react. I mean, if you just take as an example the Abraham Accords that were put together under President Trump, though I will say based on a lot of legwork that was done in previous administrations, President Obama's and President Bush's administrations. But if you look at the Abraham Accord countries that have various degrees of agreement or understanding with Israel at this point, and countries like Saudi Arabia, that the parties in the Abraham Accords are very interested in expanding to include Saudi Arabia. And you just did a press search of where China is and what the degree of different Chinese interventions, relationships, deals with each of those countries. If you looked at it 20 years ago and you looked at it now, remarkable difference of intensity and engagement from China.
After events of recent years, do countries in the region look at the U.S. as a reliable partner, either as an adversary across the negotiating table, as it was in Geneva with the JCPOA, the effort to stop Iran's nuclear program, or if you're a Kurd in northern Syria, abandoned to the tender mercies of the Turks and the Assad regime, if you're part of the federal state of Iraq and wondering in the far northwest if the little freedom, the little breathing space that you've carved out for yourself under American oversight is really safe. Where do you end up? Can you be sure that from one administration to another, America's assurances, its backing, its approach is going to remain at least somewhat consistent?
So, Ray, the thing is, I wouldn't say that, and I don't think you're suggesting that's a phenomenon of the last 20 years. That is some of the challenge inherent in the United States being a democracy where the president gets elected or reelected every 4 years, and the Congress, the House of Representatives, switches every 2 years, and the Senate every 2 years, but 6-year terms in the Senate, and that for treaties or agreements, they need to go through the Senate, not just the executive branch. All of the funding that supports the commitments we make need to get enacted through Congress. So it has long been among the challenges. I happen to believe there are a lot of benefits of being a democracy that outweigh those challenges. But it is a challenge of folks in other countries, and I would say particularly countries that perhaps don't have the same kind of systems that we have, to question what our reliability is. It is also when we as a country the changes between administrations are more extreme, let me put it that way. And I think some of what's happened is that as a society in this country, and it's a phenomenon that's happening all over the world, there's a lot of various elements that are driving politics to extremes. I don't think driving people to extremes, because I think if you look at most people for example, in the United States and how they vote and what their mindset is in most polls, most people in the country are actually in the middle of the spectrum. And it's, we can talk about, there's a lot of things that drive politics and media and what people listen to the extremes. I think that has made the shift in administrations in the United States more jarring to the outside world. In other words, it's meant that, to your point, like in the last 20 years, as various elements of our politics have been driven to the extremes, I think it's made for more abrupt changes from administration to administration in how we engage internationally as well as domestically. And that is a huge challenge for countries all over the world. And I think there are various things we could change or adjust in our system while still absolutely a democratic system, to build in more reliability. I think we have to, in making those changes, also be able to explain to the American people why it would be important to make long-lasting or multi-year commitments to different countries in various ways. But that starts from doing a better job of explaining it at home.
Well, sometimes we ask opposite numbers in other countries to do hard things, to take
Often
risks,
we ask
to
them.
stick their necks out.
Yeah.
And can we do that?
Yes, we have
and
to
make
be
some
able to do that.
assurances that we're going to stick with it.
Yes, but it's also important. We should make assurances, ideally, that we can live up to, because people are not going to, the risks that we ask leaders to take, that, to be clear, I hope we ask them to take because we believe it's in their interest or their country's interest, as well as in the United States' interest. Some of the job when you're in a diplomat seat or in a political leader seat, not seats I occupy currently, but I used to think of it as, how do you, no matter what the leader in another country is going to be taking a significant personal risk or risk to their future, or in some cases, we've seen in the Middle East is a good example, risks that cost them their lives in the statements and the positions they take. The United States can never entirely erase the risk that the leader is taking. What we can do is try to mitigate as much as possible the distance that they have to leap, the amount of risk. And we have imperfect options for doing so.
Taking a look at recent months' headlines, Saudi Arabia seems to be pushing some of its old assumptions aside. Turkey has grown richer, more powerful, more willing to throw its weight around in the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia. Is a big part of the change that you've seen during your career simply an outgrowth of the fact that now the U.S. has company and the countries in the region have options?
I think it's the behavior of different countries is based on a range of issues. We have upturns and downturns in the degree to which the United States power is unrivaled. So the 90s and the probably early 2000s were unusual in that sense. If you look at the overall over time, China has been building steadily and very rapidly, some would say exponentially, since then, and probably earlier than then in what they're able to do. And Russia has declined, though still is, as our national defense strategy and national security strategy describes them, is an acute competitor, right? But is not where it was when the Cold War that was between the United States and Russia was at its height. So if many other countries in the world are often in one way leveraging opportunities from where the various players are. And yeah, that has continued. I think Erdogan, Turkey's leader, is a particular kind of leader. I wouldn't say that I think he is aggressive in his style in the region. I wouldn't say Turkey was a country pre-Erdogan that was quiet at the sidelines either. They've always occupied a major strategic position. Erdogan may just be taking positions on things that are in a different way. I would say similarly with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In the current Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, we have someone who is seemingly has been at the center of acts that many people in the world would consider reprehensible. And at the same time, he has made significant reforms in the country. It's life for women fundamentally different than it was even a decade ago. I mean, I was astonished when I was there most recently, which was 2017, 2018, going to schools where women could drive. And now it's commonplace. And of course, women weren't allowed to drive there at all. So you have a leader there who is at best a challenging character, but Saudi Arabia was very important in the region and important for what it was able to do. And the previous crown prince and king, a kind of generation prior to MBS, and King Abdullah was also himself a pretty significant leader and figure. He may have just had a different profile in how he acted. But I think, to your point, I think leaders of any country, anywhere in the world, part of getting to be leaders is figuring out what their politics are. And frankly, whether democracies or not, you have to be good at politics and who's up and who's down and who you can leverage off of whom else to get what you need, either for yourself or for your country, or hopefully for the people of your country.
I'm glad you brought up the contrast in fortunes between Russia and China. In the Clinton years, Russia was in turmoil. A lot of countries were holding their breath out of fear of an unstable, unpredictable, poor, restless nuclear basket case. And China hadn't yet accomplished its remarkable rise and wasn't much of a factor outside of its own neighborhood. Fast forward 25 years, and China is involved in pioneering a new kind of soft power. And Russia, well, I mean, if you want to go look at Syria and what Russia's old-fashioned use of hard power looks like, they're Groznying parts of Syria. They still matter in a weird kind of way, but nobody thinks of Russia as the country of the future. How do you thread the needle there? These are two countries that will continue to challenge the United States, but with very, very different strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, I actually do think on this, again, our national security strategy put out close to the beginning of each administration, maybe in the first year and a half, captures it well in describing China as a pacing competitor and Russia as an acute competitor. In other words, the challenges we have from Russia and what Russia is doing in Ukraine, by way of example or illustration, are acute, are quite significant, and they are a major nuclear power. They are a country with endless amount of people that they're willing to throw into battle, into combat, as we're seeing in Ukraine. So a serious and acute threat. China, the reason I would describe, I think the wording pacing competitor is wise, is that, as you described, Ray, they are on a trajectory of growth, of leverage, of expansion, and the expansion of their role in the world. And their leader has been very clear about what their goals are, which is ultimately domination. Where I would say it's not just through soft power, though. I would describe it as gray zone conflict, as they have been really smart and strategic on how they have used economic means, non-kinetic means, not directly, physical conflict, to gain strength, to gain power, to gain information that they can then leverage in various ways. At the same time, and let's be clear, they have been steadily building their military power, their hard power. They've not just left that behind. They've just been working in a very steady way. I would say, though, that in the President Clinton's administration, it wasn't like China wasn't on the screen. There was a very different calculation that was made, starting from, and I think of it because Henry Kissinger is in China now. And so starting from the Nixon administration and Kissinger's trip then to China, the theory of the case was that, I believe for both Republican and Democratic administrations, was that opening up China, giving China opportunities in the world in terms of on the economic stage, for example, would lead to a future that made China more democratic. That made China more of a country that could be a real partner to the United States in various ways, and to democracies throughout the world. And so in the Clinton administration, there was great pride and a lot of hard work that went into establishing permanent normal trade relations with China. I think China has grown exponentially economically, based in part on how they have entered the World Trade Organization and then and worked a number of international organizations to their will without kind of opening up to democratic values. And so the benefit of a long strategic plan and a current leader who has been in, I believe, more than a decade or so in China, but very intent on the path that they're on. It's really kind of fundamentally changed the how the world is set up and structured. And you could argue the United States should have been better able to see or predict that from 1970, 1980 onwards. And hindsight is always 20/20.
Well, that's China. Let's talk a little bit more about Russia, because it still has ambitions in the Middle East. It's drawn Iran closer in recent months. It is still involved in Syria, yet it continues to prosecute this costly, ruinous war in Ukraine. Should we assume that Russia can walk and chew gum at the same time, that it's still going to be very much a factor in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, further afield in the Middle East? Or might it get bogged down in its current problems much closer to home?
I would say that Russia will continue to be a factor that we cannot, should not, I would not discount. At the same time, that they are, as you note, expending tremendous resources, blood and treasure, in the battle, in what they're doing in Ukraine and how they are doing it. But one of the things that Vladimir Putin has done quite effectively, and it's a danger with this kind of leader throughout the world, and we in the United States are not free from it, is to play on the emotions of many of his people. Putin has for so long carried the mantle of the importance of a greater Russia and of Russian nationalism. And so the period of time during President Clinton's administration where Russia was where it was, Putin emerged during that time, very steadily started working away at at rebuilding the Russia that is in the minds and the hearts of many, many Russian people. And he plays on that continually. So even as we in the West see him in a particular way and see right and wrong, black and white very clearly in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, even with and he may well be facing dissent from some people in Russia. And it's also obviously a country where it's very hard to publicly dissent, but there are many, many people who are also supportive of what he is doing because of how he plays into Russian nationalism.
Are Americans making a mistake if they don't watch closely what other countries in the Middle East are deciding about Russia? You mentioned that Americans tend to see it in black and white, good and bad, evil versus good terms. It seems like there's something much more nuanced going on in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, in Egypt, the countries of the old non-aligned world, the countries of the global South, much less willing to enter a harsh judgment against Russia for what it's doing.
Yes, I agree with you that it's a mistake whenever we see things in black or white and in kind of stark terms without seeing most issues on a continuum. I also think that there are many political leaders who benefit by presenting things in what I would describe as inherently fundamentalist terms, the right and wrong, the black and white. So the United States is not unique in having those kinds of views or in people being drawn to those kinds of conclusions. I think just as when you judge individuals by who they are, as opposed to trying to cubbyhole in particular ways, it's really important when we're dealing with other countries. I think there's a similar psychology in the sense that, you know, at least I try, not being I succeed, but to look at to understand the history of the country I'm dealing with, how they come to where they are, who are their stakeholders, who else are they dealing with in various ways. How did the particular leader who's there get to be there, and who does he or she depend on? And they're going to be playing all those factors. I don't think that that's new. I think that maybe what is new or newer for some people in the United States maybe to appreciate is how many different factors a leader in a given country has at play. And if you're, for example, if you're in any country in the Middle East right now, what kind of Chinese investments do you have? What is Russia supplying you? I mean, if you're South Africa, what's been your relationship with Russia and what have they delivered to you? And in terms of things you need over, last 10 years versus what do you perceive the United States has done for you and with you? And so when you're asked at the UN to take a vote against Russia on the resolution about Ukraine very early in the conflict, it may not be so automatic for you that the right vote is the vote the United States and Europeans are pushing versus when it's a vote against Russia, and there may be stuff you depend on directly in Russia. And I could play that out for you in, you know, every country in the Middle East in one way or another with Russia or China.
Well, pursuant to that, how big a role does, for want of a better term, American druthers about human rights, about elected governments, about arms sales play in determining this country's relationships with the many countries in that region? If you're ready to rethink who your friends are there ways in which an opening to China or Russia is just easier? They're not going to bother you about transparency, about bidding processes, about how many political prisoners you've got locked up.
Yeah.
Is it just easier? I
think there are trade-offs always, right, in who you're going to do a deal with and what you're going to get for the deal. So there are some things that, and I would also say, I think the United States would do better and be more effective if we did less lecturing, more showing than telling. So some of that is who we do deals with. The other is making sure that we deliver on what we promised, to the questions you raised earlier in our conversation, to position ourselves as an attractive partner in as many ways as possible that are obviously consistent with our values and our interests. And sometimes we do that well, many times maybe less well. So I think I would give us a room for improvement on that score. I would actually view the aggressiveness with which, like, let's say China in particular is pursuing deals in various parts of Latin America and the African continent and the Middle East, but frankly, more in kind of the direct stuff they need right now in different countries in Africa, for example. But they've been at it for a long time. They signed a bunch of these deals some years ago on terms that were actually pretty bad for the countries involved. But as you know, deals got signed fast. I'm sure a bunch of people got very rich very quickly who had signed those deals. And now payments are literally coming due in ways that cause significant harm, for sure, to the people of the countries involved, but also to some of the leaders who are now responsible for paying those deals. That's a window of opportunity for the United States or Europe or others to come in with better deals that are better, that are also consistent with our values and our interests, better for the environment. How do you get the kinds of minerals that are so critical for the economic supply chains that we need in this country, for our semiconductors, for our batteries? Do we have the technology, and can we help to share the technology that allows us to gather these minerals in a much greener fashion, and in a fashion that also works far better for the communities involved? Yes. Can we put together deals in a way that work and are and where benefits can be seen, ideally with minimum bureaucratic burdens. We have room to do there, but there's some opportunities and windows of opportunity for us to get smart faster on how we do this and be better partners and thus more attractive partners for people to invest with.
Is there a risk that China might overplay its hand? It seems that in some of these places where the countries are either perilously close to default or are already technically in default, China is not doing what it first threatened, which is to just repossess docks and piers and
Deep
the
water ports.
intermodal transportation networks that they built with their loaned money. They are,
and their people often.
And yes, and regularly they move in the workers, so the local people get very few jobs. Might they be seeing that it's very easy to overplay your hand in this, because it smacks of neocolonialism? If China starts taking over ports in East Africa, taking over railroads in Kenya and so on. Yeah.
Yes, there's some hope there. The question, but thus far, I don't believe they may not be acting to seize. They also have not been eager to renegotiate the terms. So I think some of what they may be watching, and where I said there's a window of opportunity, the United States, European, others need to act swiftly and smartly to seize those opportunities, because yes, China may be overplaying its hand. China also knows how to renegotiate if they need to. And if you're sitting in a country that has some of these key resources, and you had the mindset that was betting on the future of your country and not just lining your own pocket. And I recognize those are big caveats. You could play the United States and Europe off of China to really get deals that could shape the future of the entire continent, never mind just your country. You could build, you are holding the keys to the kingdom right now if you're sitting in those countries. And it's why we, the United States, need to be working, and I believe we have at least some folks who are at an accelerated pace to figure out how we can be the best partner to get some of the stuff.
You've teed me up beautifully, because I've been curious about, you're in meetings, you're in consultations, you're in councils where this stuff is hashed over. Does anyone, and maybe it's you, stand up in the meetings and just point out in horror or in frustration that part of the chronic instability in that powder keg group of nations is economic failure and governance failure, that the temperature in these places would go way down if these places weren't so badly led and people weren't working so hard for so little? In Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, in Lebanon. I mean, it's a long roll call of dishonor. People have not been able to take advantage of this rise of the rest that we see going on around the rest of the world. And the Middle East is, in many ways, as messed up as it's ever been.
Yes, there are people in most meetings I've been in and outside of government, who raise those issues in various ways. But at least when you're in government, you got to figure out what to do about it now in real time. And when you have the luxury of being outside, I still hope, I don't think it's the luxury, or I think, and we talk about this all the time at Center for American Progress, I think that we are misusing the luxury we have of being outside and dealing with these issues if we spend the bulk of our time admiring the problem. I think it's really important to analyze it and understand what the factors are, and then figure out what can you do about it and what's the pathway. And so to me, some of the pathways are taking the time to figure out where the other guy is and what's causing the other guy. The leaders in the other country, people in the countries that we're trying to deal with things as they are, figure out what can we do that can move quickly with the institutions we have to make things better on the ground. So yes, that's foreign assistance, but our foreign assistance and our development agencies work more slowly and take a lot of time. And so that's why, to me, some of the near-term options are putting together investments in a way that help us in the United States and help the people in those countries, and target specific countries where we can actually get some near-term gains that folks in the country on the ground can see and feel the difference for, and that will help us in making those kinds of arrangements in other places as well. So I think it's a way to look at where your challenges are and what your opportunities are for overcoming them.
If you've been listening to my conversation with Mara Rudman and things are occurring to you, or questions that you want to follow up on are niggling at you, please go in, enter them in the Q&A, and I'll get to as many as I can when I move to that part of the program. In the time we have left before we start taking questions from the audience, I'd like to just riff through some evolving bilateral relations that have been making the news in recent years. You can give me your impressions, whether it's a big deal, whether it's not a big deal, and what, from an American point of view, we should make sure we keep an eye on. Saudi Arabia and Iran.
I think I would describe that as the Saudis hedging their bets. That you mentioned earlier, used as an example, the agreement that the United States struck with European parties with respect to Iran and containing Iran's nuclear development, the JCPOA that the President Trump took us out of. So even though President Trump, great relationship with the Saudis for sure. I'm putting great in air quotes there, just to be clear. I think the Saudis started calculating pretty early that they needed to figure out how to manage the Iran relationship. And I think they had others in the Gulf who had been doing that in various ways for some time. So that's why I'd put it as a hedging their bets situation.
Israel is striking deals with Gulf states that look outwardly very different from the kind of chilly peace they've had with Egypt. Are they?
Yes, and their relationship with Egypt, by the way, is actually pretty warm. It may not be warm between the peoples, but it became less and less chilly over the time period of the Obama administration. And in some ways, and I say this with deep affection for all of my colleagues in the Obama administration and President Obama, we did more in bringing that region together with Israel, not in opposition to the United States, but because of their shared unhappiness with the United States policies and directions than I think had occurred previously. So I would say Israel's relationship with the Gulf and Egypt, and Morocco, I mean, is warming up now, but up there, Israel did something very smart in terms of in all politics is local, right? They just recognized Morocco's claim over Western Sahara, which for the Moroccans, Morocco and Algeria over Western Sahara is like Israeli-Palestinian. It's as existential as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there's all sorts of different kind of gatherings, and also goes back to what you mentioned about Iran earlier, because the alliances in that region between Israel, Gulf states, and others are also juxtaposed against the concern and threat that they see Iran as posing, understandably see Iran as posing.
Syria continues to be a place of tremendous human suffering and decline, and Bashar al-Assad's government was welcomed back into the Arab League. What's that about?
A lack of other options.
Mm.
Sense in which, I mean, Syria's the story of Syria is really a tragic one, and it is one that I would say all of many actors in the region share responsibility for, and certainly the United States, Russia, others, I think, share responsibility for where things ended up. But it also is part of a bigger, I would say, a bigger dynamic in what the Arab Spring was and wasn't, and the lack of ability of parties outside the region to understand and appreciate the dynamics in each country, and be able to modulate policies based on what was happening in each country, because there are different dynamics everywhere. And not that the United States or Europe or Russia could control the dynamics in each country, but I don't think that, I think we were caught by surprise at the dynamics, and then had real challenges in adapting during that time period.
Before I go to questions from the audience, one last question of my own. Has the discourse around Israel in the United States kept up with the times? Israel's a changed place. When Americans fight in Congress, in evangelical circles, in the councils of major American Jewish organizations, are they talking about the Israel that they grew up with, cut their teeth on, or the Israel that's really out there in the Eastern Mediterranean today in 2023, with Benjamin Netanyahu once again, perhaps precariously, back in charge?
I think very definitely precariously, and we can come back to that. I think Israeli democracy is facing the biggest threat currently that it has faced in its existence, which, to be clear, it's a relatively young country, and it's a country without a written constitution. But the judicial overhaul that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pushing so aggressively is poised to rip that democracy asunder. And so I actually think it depends on the American you're talking about. I see the dialogue as having moved a great deal. In dating myself, when I was an undergraduate and did my thesis on what kind of leader it took to restabilize a democracy in crisis over its territories, you weren't allowed to talk to or about the PLO. It was people were arrested in Israel. When I was on the ground during the first Intifada in 1987, if I look at the dynamics then and what Israeli friends thought of me for traipsing around the West Bank and Gaza, and what Palestinians thought and how they spoke about things, and when I came back to the United States, how it was discussed. And then I think of the, 40, 50, 60 trips I've taken back and forth since that time. I see I see a difference in how people speak and what they talk about. And part of how I measure it is, honestly, I feel like I've been speaking in similar terms and ways since that time. I think I was saying the exact same types of things I'm saying now as somebody in the radical left. And I had friends in college who called me the voice of Damascus, cynically, but, to stick it to me. And I'm saying the same things now, and I'm considered, depending on who you're talking to, middle of the road, or probably even like center right. I'm saying the same thing, and watching, the tragedy of what has been playing out over some decades there. I think that the comments that President Biden made, and that he clearly intended to make public in his conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that I've lost track of time, but sometime in the last 24 hours, I believe, that was, are quite telling. He very directly talked about the importance of the vibrancy of Israeli democracy. You can have a variety of views on what happens when the democracy is occupying land at the same time. But within Green Line Israel, within pre-67 lines of Israel, the extent of protests from every sector of society right now does show the vibrancy of that democracy. If the current prime minister pushes through with the judicial overhaul that will significantly reshape the balance of power between courts and legislature and executive branch in that country. President Biden said, like, the vibrancy of Israeli democracy is central to the shared values that the United States has had with Israel for 75 years. If that is ripped asunder, if we don't have those shared values, and what we have, and we will have, continue to have security interests for sure, shared security interests, but the nature of the relationship between the United States and Israel will be fundamentally impacted. For someone like President Biden, with, anyone who's talked to him has heard about how his first official trip to Israel, I believe, was in meeting Prime Minister Golda Meir, so people can look in their history books about what that timing is. For him to get to the point of saying that is tremendously significant. So yes, the situation has continued to worsen on the ground over the years. I think we are at a key inflection point now. And I think there's a robust debate in this country, as there should be, about the challenges going on in a country like Israel right now with its democracy. And Israel's not alone, let's be clear. There's Hungary, there's Mexico, there's India. I'm not saying they're all the same, but they're all different democracies that have significant risks. I have a hard time seeing Hungary as a democracy, but an autocratic democracy with an authoritarian leader who's very good at manipulating the tools of a democratic structure. Democracy is under threat in many places around the world, including here in the United States. And so important to be able to discuss it with one another in a candid and open way.
Let's get to audience questions. Chris asks, energy has been one of the biggest factors in U.S. relations with Middle Eastern countries. What does a shift toward renewable energy sources mean for relations with fossil fuel producers in the Middle East in the near and midterm?
So energy has been a significant factor, not the only factor. Even as we are working aggressively to phase out fossil fuels, we work on a continuum. So what I would say first is that this is over an extended period of time. And even if the United States achieves, and I certainly hope we will, even if the United States is not as dependent on the fossil fuels produced from that region as it was, there are various parts of the world that will continue to be. And so the United States' role in managing the relationships and figuring out the dynamics with respect to the tremendous oil reserves that are there will not disappear. At the same time, there are a number of other critical crises where some countries in the region have been moving faster. Some have been moving much less fast to address and embrace renewables. But the kinds of changes we're seeing in climate, again, related not indirectly to energy use, right? But the heat wave that we're going through, I don't know if folks in San Francisco are being spared, but in most parts of the country and many parts of the world right now, unbearably hot temperatures, we're getting a glimpse into what our future will be if we don't deal effectively with the climate challenges we have. And the countries in the Middle East are at like are at the front end are on the front lines for temperatures, for example, that will be hotter than is tolerable for human beings to live. And so there are a variety of issues that are going to keep us very much engaged with countries in that region, even as, and I certainly hope, that the overall global dependence on oil wanes considerably.
Sarah asks, Middle Eastern countries, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iran, as well as Russia and China, are heavily involved in conflicts in Africa, from the Central African Republic, Sudan, Ethiopia. Is the United States missing a window when it comes to Africa? Is our foreign policy weakening there compared to the Middle East and other places in the world? Is there more the current administration should be doing beyond aid?
Yes, there's definitely more we should be doing. I think we are working to do it. What I would describe, though, I'd go back to the conversation we had about how you make better and more effective deals. I think it's less about involvement in conflicts on the ground and more in being a good partner and thinking about it strategically. And and I believe, for example, the Biden administration in having, if not the first ever, the first in a long time, there's the summit with key African leaders that occurred, I believe, last December. There was Vice President Harris's trip to the region. There is a person in the White House who has a special role in coordinating various aspects of our energy policy. He has been to key African countries regularly and is working hard to put together the kinds of more attractive deals that I referenced earlier. So I think our engagement with the United States engagement with key African countries is happening. I think it needs to accelerate. And I think we're behind where we should be at this point, but it is, and it must be, about much more than foreign assistance or development aid.
Michael asks, sanctions against Iran for long-term purposes I don't really understand has driven Iran to support Russia in the war against Ukraine. Is it time to make nice with Iran? And we walked away from JCPOA, pretty bad foreign policy move. It makes us look unreliable. It's from Michael.
So Michael's put a lot of different elements into that question, I will say. Iran is a bad actor. And so there is not a making nice with Iran. And it's also, we have problems on our side, the United States, with our reliability for sure. And you use the JCPOA example in terms of the president can come in and decide to change policy, and particularly when it's not policy that is a treaty policy, when it's an agreement. So any administration can make an agreement and then the next administration can undo the agreement that was made. But the Iranian leadership is not reliable either, and is not good partners. And the Russia-Iran relationship goes back pretty far. I again, dating myself, but during President Clinton's administration, had to work with, and again, it was a Russia that was at a very different point in its time, but the ways in which Russia was working and cooperating with Iran were a huge problem for the United States, and having to manage and talk through sanctions issues then. So this has been long-standing with various ups and downs. The threat that Iran poses in terms of nuclear power is a significant and serious one, not only for the region, but for the world. And in addition to that, the extent to which the Iranian Republican Guard supports terrorist moves throughout the region and beyond is also a significant problem. So even with all of that, I think I agree with many of our leaders who have tried in various ways to get the JCPOA in some form or another reactivated. That clearly is not working. The demands that Iran made were too high for it. And so we are in a figuring out how to get through this period and this time situation, but making nice with Iran is not the answer, in my mind.
Stephen asks, what are the chances of a Kurdish country? My estimate is slim to none. What do you think?
I would agree with that estimate. And it is a conversation I've had with one of my brothers whose good friend spent a lot of time serving serving in our military in Iraq and working closely with the Kurds, and felt strongly that they should have their own country. But I think it's one of the situations where, for a range of reasons, too long to go into here, I think that the questioner was correct in his assumption that it was not likely to occur anytime in the near term.
Okay, given that, let's say you're right, and he's right. Short of a country, can Kurds be given some sort of secure place where they can dwell and not be harassed, attacked, killed, upended by the other powers in the region that have always used Kurds as a plaything,
Yeah.
and their land as a plaything?
Yeah, I would hope so. I think that the challenge is who negotiates it, who protects it, who enforces it, and at what cost to to interests of whoever is doing that, whatever country is doing that. And so it would be a good thing to be attainable. I would not put it on the near-term horizon.
Paul asks about a recent article in Harper's, "Why Are We in Ukraine?" by Benjamin Schwartz and Christopher Lane, and asks, do you agree that essentially it's America's and NATO's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine?
No, I do not agree with that at all. Russia invaded Ukraine, another sovereign country. And we, to be clear, we, the United States, we, NATO, are not in Ukraine. We're certainly supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia's invasion of that country. And in doing so, we are supporting US interests, because what Russia would do to Ukraine, if they can do it with impunity and conquer and capture that territory, who is next? And what happens when they take that action against a NATO country, where we all will be in this conflict full on, boots on the ground. And so the Ukraine is on the front lines of what was unquestionably a bigger plan by Putin as a leader, in terms of, again, what we talked about earlier in restoring a greater Russia, recreating the Soviet Union in one form or another. And so the United States, all NATO countries, many others throughout the world should share the interest in an outcome that maintains a sovereign Ukraine, and is an outcome that Ukrainian leaders support and can live with.
We've got time for one more from an anonymous attendee. How much is it failings in our own democracy which allow or enable others? Oh, no, excuse me, wrong one. Do Israel's changing political relationships in the Middle East undermine the ability of the US government to influence Israel's behavior toward the Palestinian people and their land?
So that question begs the question of what is the ability of the United States to influence in any given situation, not just between Israelis and Palestinians. In some ways, I am heartened by the confidence that people seem to have, and not just the American people, in what I would describe as outsized influence for the United States to change factors on the ground in other countries. So I would say that first. I actually think we have an opportunity through the Abraham Accords, and there is very little I would credit the Trump administration with. I would say the Abraham Accords were a good step. As I had noted earlier, it was a step that was made possible by the work of several presidents before President Trump that laid the groundwork. But to actually have the Abraham Accords work as they were intended in terms of economic and possibly security relationships throughout that region, if the United States can work and convince some of the Arab countries currently in who have agreed to the Abraham Accords, and some like Saudi Arabia that people really want to get in, to have as a prerequisite for going forward significant improvements for Palestinians and Palestinian livelihoods, economy, and future. Getting a political outcome back on the horizon. The Abraham Accords could and should be a vehicle for doing that. So I guess I would say the question on that, it's a question of how to most effectively use the influence and impact the United States has. And you always got to adapt to where your facts are on the ground and how they've changed. And so that is to me, the current window of opportunity for us.
That's Mara Rudman from American Progress. Thanks a lot, Mara. It's been a pleasure looking back and forward with you.
Thanks. Enjoyed the conversation, Ray. Appreciate it. And the very good questions from your audience. Thank you.
To learn more about World Affairs, head to the website, worldaffairs.org. You can also discover other upcoming live stream and in-person events, past program recordings, and more information about the On Shifting Ground radio program on KQED and our twice-weekly podcast. Thanks so much to you, our audience, for taking the time to be with us. Good night.